Yeah, I mean, so what I'm trying to do, like to the session, is a couple of times I'll ask everybody to think about what success means to you. And so I know there are people in the room for whom success for a project means you still have a job, right? It's nice. It's nice to get paid. It's nice to be able to eat, because the alternative to eating is quite bad. But even as people work within the project, every project has to have a goal, right? What are you really trying to do? When I was young, like 350 years ago, I used to always think that maybe I'd do something good and make a difference. But it was always a case of figuring out who make a difference to whom. And I think what I've learned in the last sort of 350 years that I've been around is the only person I'm ever going to make a difference to is myself. Right? Everybody else is optional. And if I focus on doing that for myself, then it doesn't matter if I measure success in terms of what other people think of me as, because as long as I'm doing what I want to do, I think I'm successful. Does that kind of make sense? But
is your microphone on? By any chance?
No, it's not. No, because we're actually not in the session yet.
We're not in the session yet.
No,
Yes,
we're on the heckling warming up session. Okay, is that better? Oh.
Better, and it's recorded.
Okay, so I need to now be more careful about what I'm saying. I made a statement the other day. We were talking about CI, and I know this is being recorded. I made a statement about there are two ways of doing CI, especially when it relates to release engineering. One way of doing it is that you actually run all the tests and you release when your tests pass. And then there is the Oracle model of release engineering, which is you run all the tests on the day you want to do your delivery. Everything that fails, you disable those tests, and then you do your release. I think we've had a few situations in MySQL's history when releases were made by disabling CI tests rather than actually getting the test to pass. So, hi.
It's the usual way we handle failing tests if it or a rawhead or so. We just disable them.
Okay. Yes, I'm very keen on testing. I enjoy testing. I spent 6 years of the last sort of 14 years of my life working in a agile, Scrum-driven, extreme programming enthusiast Web 2 development shop, where people really struggled on a Thursday to remember what they were doing on a Monday. And the only way to make sure things worked was to write a lot of tests, so that you didn't have to remember on a Thursday what you were doing on Monday. You just trusted your tests to hopefully pass, as long as the code you were working on today didn't change anything that you were doing on Monday.
Okay, hi, it's time to start. Our next talk is from Karanbir Singh. He works at the CentOS Project, CentOS Project.
Yeah, there's a slight difference.
Yeah. And he has a lot of experience in Linux, I think about 18 years, so that's remarkable. And let's hear his lecture.
Thanks, yeah. So I work for Red Hat, and I work on the CentOS project. So a quick sort of brief about where I come from, so that people have where I'm going from here. I started off back in the days. I had my first computer was an Atari 65, which had I think 64 kilobytes of memory or something. Started doing assembly language for many years. Thought I'd become a developer. Went to university. So I come from India, and in India, it's you're not really considered to have grown up unless you've got a graduate degree, and you don't really get respect from your grandparents till you have a master's degree. Unfortunately, I never got a master's degree, but I did try quite hard to work on a statistics honors degree. Only because I went to do computer sciences, and I realized that they were going to teach me COBOL and Fortran, and I was going to have to learn how to make PCBs and 8086 stuff. So I was like, this is really hard. I really do not want to do this. So I dropped out of that and went and did statistics honors instead. Set up a little software company, did development for many years. We grew to a point where we were 15 people, and then the operations guys had to get involved. And as a developer, I used to always think the operations guys were wrong. I was like, what are you sysadmins doing, right? There has to be a better way of doing this. So then in 2002, I switched over from development to being an operations guy, being a sysadmin guy. And now 13 years down the road, I'm still a sysadmin guy, and I'm still questioning my decision about operations being wrong. So that's basically where I came from. I got involved with the CentOS project back in 2004 when my day job was using a lot of Red Hat 7.3. I don't know how many people have used 7.3, but I think it was a great release. Sorry?
Is it the code name of Valhalla?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting name as well, right? Martyrdom was a good way of putting that release, I guess. And we were trying to do some interesting things. I was working on what was big data at the time. You know, we had about a couple of hundred machines running MySQL in a sharded setup, and we were using the Intel compiler to build it. And we had a real-time patch in the kernel. It was a stack that Red Hat wasn't happy to support for us, so we said, you know, look, what else can we do? And I got involved with the project. And now, I guess, you know, 11 years down the road, I'm still around. But one of the key founding issues about why CentOS was relevant and why CentOS was important was that it was always delivered by a bunch of people who used it. It was never developer-led. And I'll try and explain what that means, you know, through the course of the next sort of 15, 20 minutes. Is there anybody here who doesn't know CentOS? Okay, so that's the rest of my presentation done. So I guess one thing that isn't always very clear is, you know, there are three parts to CentOS. There is the user community, which is effectively what everybody really cares about, right? Everybody here, I guess, is a part of that community. But there are also two very distinct parts of CentOS, which is the CentOS Project and the CentOS Linux distribution. A lot of people seem to think of CentOS defaulting to CentOS Linux, and it really isn't. Maybe we haven't done a very good job of communicating this because the CentOS Project has always been a very small group of people. And we always made it, you know, really, really hard for people to get into the project, because our you know, understanding was that if we keep it really hard, that only people who understand the platform, only people who understand the ecosystem, and only people who are going to make decisions for the community and endorsed by the community will ever be able to get in. So the benefit of that is you get people who are all thinking about the same thing. The hard part of that is that you get a very small number of people who come through that. And that is the bit that we're trying to change. And I'll try and go through, you know, what these three bits are and how they kind of map to where CentOS is today. So the first part of it is the project, right? The CentOS project itself. It's a small number of people. We have an independent governing board. There's very heavy Red Hat representation on there, purely because of where we work. There's no reason for Red Hat to be a majority or anything like that in there. And there are a few things that the project cares about. The project cares about making sure that we create an ecosystem that other people can join. We have to control the trademark issues. We have to triage and monitor security issues. So, you know, if you have like 100 people contributing code into CentOS, security at CentOS.org will always be the destination for all security issues from everybody. So we try and communicate that. We make sure we socialize that idea, that send all of issues to security at CentOS.org. And security at CentOS.org and git.centos.org are the only two assets that are run by the CentOS project. And if you notice up here, there is no Linux distribution. So Linux distribution comes next. That's the second part of the pyramid. And what we've done with the CentOS Linux distribution is that we've made it into a special interest group. And that interest group, that SIGs, primary focus is delivering CentOS Linux. So effectively that means that it is now easier for people to get into that group. It is easier for that group to expand. It is easier for that group to shrink. It is easier now for that group to take on more infrastructure and drop infrastructure as needed, because it's nothing more and nothing less than a special interest group. But what they are sort of, you know, let's say the guiding light, the beacon that they're trying to force down, is that they will always aim to deliver an RHEL rebuild, RHEL source rebuild as a downstream. So that remains their primary mandate. But it runs as a special interest group and is not influenced by the board. A lot of people are common, but hopefully over time that will change as well. And we have although a bunch of guys who are in the core SIG right now work at Red Hat, not everybody in the core SIG works at Red Hat. So what we try and do is we try and create a situation where the people who work at Red Hat have no special privilege with RHEL than the guys who don't work at Red Hat. So if somebody like Ralph Angenin doesn't work at Red Hat, if he doesn't have access to some particular knowledge about RHEL, we make sure that the other core guys also don't have access to the same sort of information. Does that kind of make sense? A little bit? Yeah, okay. The third part of it is the community, and this is like the important part of, you know, how the whole CentOS ecosystem came up. typical open source communities are a bunch of guys, like Fedora. It's a bunch of people who care about the code, and they perhaps have user stories, but most of the open source communities will be about code. The CentOS user communities are actually a users-focused community rather than a contributor or a developer community. And that creates some interesting challenges because they have expectations on what kind of code is going to be released into CentOS. But what they also do is that they create a phenomenal support ecosystem. If you have a problem, there is a good chance. Like I remember back in 2009, there was when SGI was still kind of around. Maybe they're still around, but there were a couple of guys who had XFS issues, and this was out of the supercomputing setup in Sweden, and so they were trying to figure out a particular problem, and they posted to the CentOS mailing list. And we noticed that we had the supercomputer guys from Imperial College in London, we had Barcelona, we had a couple of high performance physics laboratories from the US. There was a whole bunch of these guys who were all consuming CentOS in exactly the same way, who were able to get together and try and solve the problem in the community. But this is also a community that does not typically contribute back in terms of bug fixes, in terms of code, and they set expectations that stuff that they're going to see, things that are going to show up in CentOS, have been pre-tested, have been pre-developed elsewhere. Does that kind of make sense? So, and how that maps down to velocity is that a lot of what we do in CentOS tends to be problem-driven. And that is what the user base will accept as well. They accept solutions to problems rather than blinding new features. So if you come up with an idea that, hey, I know how I can make A plus B is equal to D, then the best place to do it is to go do it in Fedora. But if you can figure out a way of making ext4 run 6% faster, then a great place to come and talk to people about it is in the CentOS ecosystem. Similarly, like if the Gluster guys are doing the releases, then a great place to do those releases is through the CentOS ecosystem. But if you're doing upstream development of features, then Fedora is a really great place to target that kind of development at. So the key there being, it's problem focused rather than feature driven. People are going to be more willing and more accepting of solutions to problems they really have, rather than new features that perhaps need a bit more airtime before they get to stable stages.
Question.
Sure.
What is the best way for the upstream community to connect to these user communities?
Okay, so if I don't answer that question in the rest of my presentation, then I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so a lot of people here are involved with various open source projects, right? So within your own minds, and I asked you to do this initially as well, think about what success actually means to your project, right? Not in a personal capacity, but think about it as a project layer, right? What does success really mean? Does it mean 1 million users? Does it mean I don't know, you've scratched an itch? Does it mean you've been able to commercialize a product? What does it mean to you as a project, right? Think about that, and then see how CentOS can kind of perhaps try and map into this. So getting started engaging with the user base, right, is for an open source community is via code. And there are a whole bunch of special interest groups that are up at the moment. So if any of these kind of maps to the area that you're interested in, right? So if you're into storage, virtualization, if you're into cloud infra, if you're into cloud instance, if you're into artwork, promo, if you want to write documentation, everybody loves to write documentation, right? So we need people to write documentation. That's a very high critical interest group. If you're into system hardening, if you're interested in voice over IP, all of those are areas that you can automatically get involved with, right? We have very low barriers to entry into a SIG. And in most cases, all that it means is applying and talking to the guys who run the SIG at the moment and setting up a social communication channel between them. There are no contributor agreements to sign. There is no licensing offload that you need to do. All that we ask you to do is make sure that the software you bring into the ecosystem is redistributable. And if that means an NVIDIA binary for firmware, that's fine. But just make sure it's redistributable. If you want to bring in Java payloads that you pre-built, as jar files somewhere else, that's fine as well. Just make sure that licensing allows you to redistribute all of that code. So we don't really care if it's, whatever, if it's rebuildable from source or whatever. And we try and encourage people to use the Fedora packaging guidelines, but we don't enforce it. And there's nothing to sign, which means you can get in and you can get out really quickly. So one of the things that came up was what are the stuff that the board looks at, right, when you're onboarding a SIG. One of the things that the board will always try and keep an eye on is making sure that you're getting security fixes in. Making sure that if the upstream story changes, then your components, the components that you care about, also change in line with that. Because what happens with the SIG is that we want to make it agnostic from the platform itself. So CentOS Linux does whatever CentOS Linux does. But if a SIG decides that, hey, we want to deliver a stack of software which is relevant to high performance computing. We want them to be able to deliver a story that is relevant to that particular community, not necessarily a story that is relevant to the CentOS community. Okay, so I think maybe this is a good time for an example. I'll tell you what that means. In 2009, CentOS 6 was sort of getting out of the door. CentOS 5 was massive. I think something like 85% of our user base was CentOS 5. Was it maybe 2010? 2010. And somebody who was using CentOS had a problem with a Samba package. Now, because he's obviously not a RHEL customer, he can't go and open a support ticket at RHEL. But the problem he had was a really corner case. It was a very small corner case that not a lot of other people would experience. And it was something to do with extremely high load on a backed by a NetApp box. So he didn't really have a lot of places to go. So the general recommendation from the community was, hey, why don't you go speak to the Samba guys? Now, the Samba guys, and I say this with a lot of respect, are one of the most accommodating upstreams that you can find. Most upstreams are not this accommodating. So when you go to an upstream community, the first answer you get to the question is, are you running my build that I released yesterday? If you're not, then how do I know that the problem you're talking about isn't solved in my release from yesterday? So this particular person had a problem. He couldn't go to those guys, and he didn't really have enough of a user exposure in the CentOS community itself to be able to find a solution for his problem. And he was stuck between a hard place and a rock kind of thing. Where do I go from here? So what we want the SIGs to do is, if a SIG is packaging Samba code, we want them to be able to deliver Samba's upstream's story in that SIG. Similarly, like the audio guys, we want the audio guys to deliver an upstream OpenStack story that is relevant to the OpenStack communities. So when somebody has a problem with the audio stack on CentOS, he has opportunities to go and look into and talk to the upstream projects as well. It shouldn't really be like, hey, my name is KB, and this is my interpretation of what OpenStack should really be doing, right? Because then what's happening is that you're not helping anybody. You're not helping the upstream communities. You're not helping the platform, and you're definitely not helping build the user experience on the platform. Does that kind of make sense? That so what that also means is that we give the projects as much flexibility as they need. So if a project wants to come on board and say, hey, look, I'm doing virtualization or visualization for the oil and gas industry, and for that I need to be able to run NVIDIA cards, in 6-way CUDA clusters, and I need this firmware to work like this, and I need the software to work. Then we will work with that project to try and find a way to make it happen. And if they can't ship it as RPMs, then that's fine. We'll try and figure out a way, like for example, like Open Daylight. We're trying to build an Open Daylight story, and Open Daylight is like classic Java programs, and I'm not a big fan of Java programs, but this is like one of my favorite Java programs, where the dependencies within components within Open Daylight on the same library, but different versions of the same library. So, and I'm sure you guys know how that goes, right? And they can't change those because nobody cares about those pieces of code anymore, and it's on the roadmap to replace it 6 months or a year down the road. But people want to use Open Daylight today. So we worked out a way where if we're not building RPMs for them, we're doing it through Docker containers, and we'll just ship a container, and that will be their release path or whatever. So again, coming back to what we were talking about, if your story or if your project fits into one of these areas, then the best thing to do is talk to the guys who run the SIGs, and all of the details are available on the CentOS wiki. Talk to the guys who run the SIGs and socialize a way of getting in to them. Now, if it doesn't, then start your own SIG. I know Lala went through all of the bits that are involved or whatever. It's a fairly painless process. We've tried to make it as simple as possible. We've tried to make it as easy as possible. The intention being that onboard as many SIGs as you can. All the SIGs that don't work, go away, right? If you bring on 100 SIGs, that's fine. If you bring on 50 SIGs, that's also fine. If at the end of a year only 10 are left behind, perhaps those are the only 10 who actually deserve to be left behind, or who have the velocity to kind of work as a SIG. It's a pretty simple, straightforward process. So what we offer from the project side of things is firstly isolation from the platform. So you never have to worry about what the platform is doing. So you can deliver your story independently. You don't have to care about the fact that RHEL 6.6 or 6.5 shipped half a Gluster implementation. The Gluster project can still build whatever Gluster that they want to push through in their SIG. And then whatever relationship you want to set up. So for example, the QEMU guys are setting up something, the libvirt guys are setting up something. So the libvirt guys can now consume the QEMU from a different SIG, and that libvirt is then consumed by the cloud infrastructure SIG, for example, for the RDO stuff, and then the OPNFE guys are then consuming RDO from the cloud SIG. And you have cross-pollination across the various SIGs or whatever. And what we try and drive towards is, don't think about this in terms of RPMs and packages and people pushing in source. Think about it in terms of impact and influence. So for example, the OPNFV guys don't really have a direct relationship with the QEMU guys at the bottom of the stack, but they have impact. They're impacted by changes that happen in QEMU. So think about it in those terms. And what we will then try and set up is that if a change happens in QEMU, we try and find a way to communicate that change upstream to the RDO guys or to the OPNFV guys, people who are impacted by that change. And then we will help you build, test, and deliver, and then hopefully maintain in a community space whatever it is that you're pushing out. So we have a pipeline that kind of looks like this. And if you have Steve Ballmer on your development team, then that's probably a good place to be anyway. But you can develop your code wherever you want. You can be in Bitbucket. You can be on GitHub if you want. You can actually have developers directly developing against git.centos.org, and that's up to you. We have a build system that hooks in directly into Git. So if you want to opt out, we can't do this yet, but hopefully this will happen pretty soon, that if you want to actually opt out of interfacing with the build system, you'll be able to do that by using triggers in your Git repositories, where you can have every commit go through a process and go through a build cycle or whatever. We can't do this yet, but it's on the roadmap. It should happen fairly soon. We have a build system that's driven by Koji. We have a test and a QA harness that is coming up right now. We've got a few projects that are in there at the moment. We have a release process that allows you to get up onto the CentOS mirror network, which is about 4,500 mirrors. I think there were 380 of them which were out of date yesterday. I need to figure out what's going on with that. And then hopefully kind of build that release process into a community ecosystem where you can then use mailing lists in CentOS.org. You can use the bug tracker on CentOS.org. You can use some of the distribution mechanisms of CentOS.org. So for example, we have relationship with Google Compute and with Amazon. And you can then leverage that relationship to deliver your code into those ecosystems. So you can actually, as a SIG, you could deliver a Ceph story or a Gluster story or an RDO story or an OpenShift story into CentOS's EC2 marketplace. And we will help you facilitate that. And then whatever benefits you get out of that are, they kind of descend down onto you. And similarly with Google Compute and HP Cloud and Rackspace or whatever. There are, I believe as of 1st of January this year, we had 79 different cloud and VPS vendors that we had some sort of a relationship with in the project. The two notable ones that we don't have a relationship with are DigitalOcean. They don't seem to want to talk to us. And we also don't have anything with Linode at the moment, and I'm working on trying to figure that out. The other interesting thing about this pipeline is that you can join and exit this pipeline at any point that you want. So if you want to opt out of using git.centos.org, you largely can. We recommend that you don't, but you largely can. So you can go into the build system using SRPMs. And if you want to use the CI infrastructure, we really encourage you to do so. But if you want to skip that, you're welcome to skip that. You're welcome to go directly from build system to release. Like for example, if the Ceph guys are already doing their CI separately and they don't want to do the CI with CentOS, then that's fine as long as they can trust the builds that are going through and they test it somewhere. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So I mean, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions.
Question. So why would somebody? Don't you think if somebody skips the pipeline, maybe create a problem longer term, or maybe if they host their code in GitHub, so it's actually not symmetrical to what other SIGs are doing. So somebody wants to try out figuring the code where it is. You might go to git.centos.org and cannot find it. Right?
Yeah, I think so. So what will happen, I guess, in the yeah, I mean, so if different SIGs are doing different things, how will the story line up, right? So in many cases, it will actually line up in a very even kind of way. So if you're developing your code on GitHub, for example, then we'll mirror that code across to git.centos.org. So your connection into Koji will still be through git.centos.org. But you don't have to worry about that because we set up the mirrors. So if commits are going into GitHub, we just mirror them across to git.centos.org. One of the classic cases for this was the SEL group. I mean, they want to maintain the dist-git in a format that is different from what we are doing. So the aim over there is to write a translator that takes their dist-git interpretation and translate it to how we want the layout to be. And then what happens is they can focus on the things that they care about, which is the code, and then we help them figure out things in the pipeline behind the scene. So you'll still see components in everywhere. I mean, if somebody decides to skip CI, it means they have a test which says is 1 equal to 1. They'll still have a test. The test will be is 1 equal to 1. And then when they go to the users and say, hey, trust this code because we tested it, hopefully the user will go back and say, hey, hang on, I've seen your test. I don't trust it. Hopefully, so then the community ecosystem then creates enough of a feedback loop that people can that people are encouraged to do that. So like the Atomic SIG is now committed to actually delivering tests before they deliver a stable release. So we have nightly builds going through, we have images going through, but there are no stable releases till such time as we can have a test harness in place. Hopefully that'll happen soon. And we're very, very committed. We're very, very committed to making this happen. And as an example of that, so this is the CI infrastructure that we're putting up right now. This is in production at the moment. It's 128 nodes spread over 2 C micro boxes. We've got 64 Intel and 64 AMD boxes. We're going to triple this capacity in the next 24 months. And this just gives you an idea of the sort of commitment that we have to the pipeline. The build system that we have right now has 448 cores, I think over 1.5 terabytes of memory, and it's all backed with fairly good storage and everything. And this becomes important because further down the presentation, I mean, we'll get to that. We, from the project side of things, we're trying to take away the complexity of running this infrastructure from the project, so that the project can focus on the things that they care about, which is writing code and getting users to use that code. And then we try and abstract all of the complexity around the pipeline away from the projects who don't want it. If, for example, the RDO guys have some very specific requirements about CI, and they're welcome to come on board here, do what they want to. And we don't mind that at all. But if, for example, Gluster doesn't want that and they just have a test suite they want to run, then we'll figure it out for them and we'll get the pipeline in for them. So the key parts of what we're trying to deliver for the users is things have to be simple. Everything is simple, straightforward. There are no contributor agreements. There is a single place that you can go to request access. You go to bugs.centos.org. And this is a bit of a private joke actually a couple of us had, was many years ago we thought whenever somebody asks for privileges to do something, we must punish that guy. Right? This is how enthusiasm must never go unpunished. So one of the things that we've got right now is that every time you need access to something, you have to go and file a bug report, right? That hey, I need access, and you have to file, to find the proper category for it and the right project for it or whatever. Anyway, that's a bit of an inside joke there. But so what we've tried to do is make everything as simple as possible to abstract the complexity of it. And projects can come in, like the OpenShift guys want to come in and they want to run their CI in a particular way. They want to own everything. They want their own Jenkins. They want their own controller stuff. And they're most welcome to do so. And they're welcome to take up as much of it as they want and as little of it as they want. And we will try and help them up from everything else that they don't want to come in with. And a lot of projects who want to come on board, they don't want the complexity of having to deal with Koji. So we've set up, I think based on the work that Ian has done, I don't know if Ian is here or not. Based on the work that Ian has done, we've got triggers in Koji that let you target alternative artifact delivery. So you can set up an SRPM to give you a Docker container at the other end, and you can build your Docker manifest. And every time something changes within that manifest tree, so anytime an RPM changes that is included in the Docker container, you'll get a new Docker container at the other end. Similarly, we can do things like have cloud images auto-generated based on what people are doing and things like that. So all of this stuff is triggered from a simple Git push. So you don't have to own any of the complexity you don't want. And that's a key part of what we're trying to do. I've kind of covered the abstracted complexity part of it. The other part of it is functional. That we want things to be complete. We want stuff to be, you start with where the open source projects get involved. That is your code. And you finish where the user story actually starts. So you finish with the mailing list, so you finish with the releases, you finish with the bugs, you finish with wherever you want your user story to go, whatever your deliverables are. And make sure that it stays focused on the inbound side to developers. So we want the Git side of things, we want the Koji side of things to be very developer friendly. And in many cases that means having APIs that they can automate against, making sure that they have all of the functions that they need to be able to do what they're doing, making sure there are the Git manifests that they need, making sure we have flexibility and source control that they need. And on the outbound focus, we want to make sure that it's very easy to consume for the users. So, it has to be a single step. Whatever comes out of a SIG has to be not more than one step away from the user. Like the Gluster story is an easy example. You do yum install CentOS release Gluster, and then you can actually install yum install Gluster. And that is very important. So that's one step away from the user. Now, when Ceph comes in, they'll probably end up using something similar to this. The OpenAFS guys are trying to do something similar as well. And they have a slightly more complicated story, but the SCST guys have something similar to this as well. And the key part of it is never more than one step away from where the user is. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Any questions around that? Any concerns? No. Okay. And then what that effectively means is that we feature complete. And if we feature complete, now okay. So this is one of those favorite things, right? Everything these days is as a service. So I'm going to misuse the platform as a service over here and say that what CentOS gives you today is a Linux platform as a service. So you chuck your code in at one end and you get users at the other end, right? But one of the key parts of it is be pragmatic, and I've kind of touched on this a few times, that if you have specific requirements, and if you can justify why, suiting what predefined conventions they may exist in CentOS as not being suitable for what you're doing, we're happy to change. Like what we did for the SAL guys, Brian Stenson is actually writing in a translator that takes their dist-git format and converts it to the dist-git format that we're consuming in CentOS. And we will do that kind of work with you. We'll try and help you out. It's not always possible to have SLAs and timelines on those, but we'll do our best, and we'll try and make sure that we can really get stuff across to you in a way that works best for you. So what is the actual opportunity? So why should you come and engage with the CentOS project? CentOS project firstly has a very large user base. I don't know about specific numbers, it's kind of hard to get to, but millions have been quoted at various points. And it's very kind of cross-functional. So we've got a very large presence, for example, in hosting. We've got a very large presence in cloud, and both in on-instance cloud and infrastructure as a cloud. Of the 4 sort of big on-premise cloud environments, 3 of them default to only being supported on CentOS. So CloudStack, Eucalyptus, and OpenML are only supported on CentOS. OpenStack is a slightly different story, but we're trying to fix that as well. Hopefully we'll get there at some point. And then on the other side, we've got diagonal sort of vertical industries where we've done really well. And for example, the voice over IP industry is very heavily embedded in CentOS as well. We've got a lot of academia, and we've got a lot of high performance computing setups who are using CentOS today. There's a lot of big embedded. So embedded where it's not exactly sort of not my phone, for example. I wouldn't want to run CentOS on my phone. But if you've got a NAS box, if you've got a couple of gigs of RAM, there's a pretty good chance that under the hood it may actually be running CentOS. So there's a very extensive, there's a cross-pollinated ecosystem around the users, and it maps across a very large set of demographics, and the numbers are big. So being able to put stuff across into those ecosystems means that you can then build relationships into those ecosystems as well. So if you have, let's pick up an example. If you're doing something about provisioning, right, provisioning at scale, or if you're doing config management, or if you're working on a monitoring solution, then a really good place to come and do that is in the CentOS ecosystem on the CentOS platform, because the user base is very ready to consume that kind of stuff. Now, one thing that is very marked about the CentOS ecosystem also is that it's very heavily sysadmin user side, very little developer desktop side. Having said that, 18.3% I believe of all CentOS installs have Firefox installed on them. So I don't know how that maps to Fedora or how that maps to other Linux desktops or Linux server environments or whatever. So there are people who do run it on the desktop as well. The key part of that was to build relationships. Build relationships into the user base using CentOS as your vehicle into that user base, because the user is already using CentOS. The second part of the opportunity is that the CentOS platform allows you to focus on only the bits that you care about. If you're in the business of writing a new version of Ruby, then the CentOS platform gives you a platform that's going to be consistent because of the RHEL relationship for years to come. So what you can do is you can build your Ruby bits knowing that everything else around you isn't going to fall apart every 6 months or 8 months or a year and a half. And if things do fall apart, it's typically not a problem that you have to cater to, because it means that we screwed up or we've caused an issue on our side of things. So typically it's like, if zlib, for example, breaks its ABI into your code, then that's something that we really need to fix. Right? If bind loses its API, then that's something that we probably screwed up on. And that's again a key part of the developer, what is success. For success for a lot of people is focusing on the code that you care about without having to curate the entire ecosystem around you. And CentOS lets you kind of do that. Also because there's no SLAs, there's no guarantees, there's no warranties, which means you can break whatever you want in whichever way you want and how many ever pieces you want. And you get to own whatever is the technical debt that comes out of that breakage, because there's no guarantees or warranties anyway.
How does that play though with the projects that rely on projects, where you just said that you're kind of guaranteeing that you don't break things for others? So if a SIG uses another SIG's project and they break stuff, that's then the SIGs to handle, or do you get involved then too?
So there's two things here. One part of it is the CentOS platform, and there's no guarantees. Right. We do our best. Okay. And if you break something, then tell us and we'll try and fix it. Okay. But so within the SIG itself, we try and work on the whole idea of impact and influence. So like if the OPNFV guys rely on something downstream, what we'll try and do is we'll try and make sure that stuff changing downstream is communicated to them. Okay. And a large part of that will again be an artifact of the CI infrastructure. That if everybody does do the testing and they do it nightly, then you'll see changes coming up before things happen. Okay. This is like one of the things that we've got going on with the Apple setup as well is that we want Apple to become more like CentOS and lesser like Fedora
Mm-hmm.
for us to be able to consume it. So for right now, we're just taking everything from Apple and trying to curate all of it internally. And the thing over there is that if a SIG that relies on another SIG, which in turn has a dependency that they rely on in Apple, there needs to be some mechanism for impact to be communicated upstream, and the upstream guys have to have some way of asserting influence on the packages in Apple.
Yeah. Okay.
The mechanics for that are still sort of up in the air. At the moment, it looks like that means every Friday afternoon there'll be a big conversation about packages to be released next week.
Okay.
And then people will have a chance to say, oops, oh, hang on, don't release that. It's going to break my stuff.
Okay.
But we're hoping that in the next 3 to 4 months, the CI pipeline becomes robust enough that people can see stuff happening.
All right.
And then what we want to be able to do is that, like if RDO relies on Python Boto from Apple, and then if the RDO nightly CI run consumes a testing Python Boto from Apple, then we want that to become a +1 karma to the Bodhi instance running behind the Apple release mechanism.
Yeah.
To say that, hey, look, it kind of does what we need it to do.
Right.
So it goes both ways.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Thank you.
Right. And then leverage the toolchain. Leverage what we've got in place because we're doing this anyway, right? Most people are not in the business of running a Jenkins instance, but Jenkins can get bulky. So we're running it anyway. Why do you want to run your own Jenkins? Come use the one that we're running. We're running a CI pipeline. Why run your own? Come consume the one that we've got. We've got 4,500 machines in the CentOS Mirror network. We can deliver at about 1.3 to 1.7 terabytes per second across the entire Mirror network at release time, and it doesn't cost us a single dime. Why do you want to set up your own distribution network? Come use the one that we have. Because this is what we're trying really hard to focus on, that build the infrastructure and then let you guys come and consume that sort of stuff. And all of this comes to you with an extremely low barrier to entry. There are no contributor licensing agreements. There's nothing you have to sign. There is no reason for you to kind of say that, hey, I'm going to have to dedicate a certain amount of time. You set the expectation that your users hopefully will buy into. Right? If you don't do a security update for 6 to 8 months, then that's a problem that you need to communicate to your user base. That's not a CentOS issue. We will encourage you to do so. If you don't do it for 6 to 8 months, somebody from the board will probably come down and say that, look, do you guys want to think about backing up the SIG? So hopefully it doesn't come down to that. But if it does, then the board will get involved and try and do that. And the framework for contribution is also very liberal. As long as you can redistribute it, even in some cases if you can't redistribute it, for example, if you want to build MariaDB using the Intel compiler collection because you get, whatever 0.68% performance increase on, a hash indexing algorithm under certain cases, we're happy to engage with Intel to try and get redistribution rights for that build to actually go through the CentOS ecosystem. So we're happy to work with you on stuff like this, which perhaps a lot of other projects won't be that interested in doing. So then again, coming back to what is success. So for us, we've never been in the numbers game. The CentOS project for us before the Red Hat days was always about having a platform that we could consume. I mean, I've used CentOS at my day job for the last, 9-10 years. And everybody else contributing into CentOS was using it because they were doing it as well. They were using it at the day job. So what is success for us today is making sure that we continue to deliver a platform that is consumable by other projects to build their success stories on. So as long as we can do that, CentOS is a successful project, regardless of where the user stories go, regardless of the numbers and things like that. And those are my details. I put my phone number up there as well. Feel free to reach out. Feel free to call me, depending on whichever time zone you're on. I work fairly weird time zones, so you might be surprised. 3 o'clock in the morning, I might be there to pick up the phone. I always try and make sure that I'm very highly available to everybody who's wanting to contribute into the SIGs and into the CentOS ecosystem. So hopefully the other SIG guys will tell you and agree to that. Now, does anybody have any questions about CentOS? Does anybody have any questions about the Red Hat relationship? Does anybody have any questions about SIGs and contributing into CentOS? I'm happy to cover that. Yeah, we've got one here.
Do all the stuff that people want fit in the model of SIGs? For example, what I'm thinking about is that everybody knows that RHEL 7 there is no 32-bit build, and so if somebody wanted the 32-bit build, is the good way to create a SIG and focus on rebuilding everything as 32-bit? Because I think it somehow stands beside of this structure of SIGs.
So the question is, does everything fit into a SIG model, right? So one of the artifacts, one of the things that falls out from having an extremely low barrier to entry is that there's also no chain of responsibility because you haven't signed up to anything. You haven't committed to doing anything. So how we work around that is by asking people to join SIGs so that they can socially build the confidence that they need for the user stories. So for example, if you were to go to the storage SIG and say, hey, I want to do a 32-bit, distribution for CentOS 7, they'll probably be like, why do you want to do it in the storage SIG? We've got nothing to do with that. So it'll be up to you to create that group, and then it'll be up to you to create that confidence that what you're doing is actually relevant to what everybody else wants down the road. And then you get to communicate that trust. We'll do a few things. We'll go do a bit of background research. We'll see who the guys are, what you've done in the past, whether you're capable of doing what you're promising or whatever. But the SIG mechanism is like an umbrella that allows users to have some level of confidence within localized groups.
Okay.
It also means that from our side, we can let you do whatever you want to do. So if we were to say that, hey, come do it as a part of the core SIG, then you'll have to fall into line with what the core SIG is doing, which is things like we always want security updates to be built within X number of hours. We always want to make sure that the mirror network is available, to a certain degree, like we want 99.8% or whatever. Then we don't want SIGs to have to sign up to all of those deals that the core SIG is trying to maintain. So I don't know if that makes sense. So the SIG mechanism actually allows us to build the umbrellas that, then you can build your own kind of user story. And for the 32-bit build, there is a 32-bit build available now in testing. So hopefully we'll have one fairly soon. But I would highly recommend that you go and sell that computer that you bought in 1996. maybe time, just out of respect for old age, right? Let it kind of go away now.
Well, sometimes it's not just about a computer. Like if you have a MacBook and it has low amount of RAM, then running 64-bit system on it, it's just taking a lot of RAM for no reason. So it's not only about an old hardware, I think. In like this hobby users area.
So with CentOS 7, you have to live with the understanding that perhaps upstream code might change in a way that we may not be able to port those changes to 32-bit. So as long as you work within that expectation, then you should have access to a build in the next couple of weeks' time. There's a question there.
Well, two questions. Can you tell me about the timescales for porting security fixes once they're released from RHEL into core? And are there any plans with EUS and Z streams with CentOS core?
So the question is, how do RHEL security updates map to CentOS Linux updates? There's no change in the relationship on that front from the pre-Red Hat to post-Red Hat days. So we still get access to sources only when they show up on git.centos.org. And then we build everything that shows up in a way that it can be consumed within the distribution. So the EUS and the Z-stream stuff, I don't think all of it actually makes it out. But whatever does make it out is stuff that we would build and release. In terms of timelines, we try and do it as fast as we can. But there are still manual processes involved, like the signing process is manual. The testing before signing is still manual because you want to make sure, the implications of shipping a broken RPM are pretty severe. So we don't want to do that. So there's a few steps in there which are manual, and those take between 4 to 6 hours to do. So depending on time of day, depending on when the release happens upstream, who's doing what. If everybody's sitting on a plane flying away from FOSDEM, and then there's this massive glibc update that comes through,
That would
then
never happen.
yeah, that would never happen. So there would be people like me sitting at the Eurostar terminal in London, trying really hard to get the builds done and pushed through, and then Johnny sitting, between connecting planes in Dallas, at Dallas Airport, that's Washington, right? And trying to figure. There are sometimes things like that might happen, but typically we try and get security updates out, as soon as we possibly can. Typically, sort of day and a half. So I'm being told I'm out of time, but maybe if you guys have questions, we can carry on. Is there maybe we can do one more question or something if anybody has anything they want to bring up.
I would like to add to your answer around the security updates. So I work for the product security team in Red Hat, and a lot of times sometimes CentOS updates are out faster than Dell, because Dell it takes a lot of time for us to push those updates and things like that. So in several occasions we have observed that CentOS was the first to push out an update, and then Dell update took a couple of hours or maybe even a day after that because our infrastructure was the second thing is because Karanbir is now a part of Red Hat, we often give him a heads up about the next big issue is coming up, so you keep prepared over.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Is anything else anybody wants to bring up? No, cool. Well, thank you for coming along, and.